Good evening, everybody, and welcome to The Trouble Begins, brought to you by the Mark Twain House and Museum. My name is Jody. I'm the Director of Collections at the Mark Twain House. It is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. Before we get started, I want to go over a couple administrative things. First, we want to thank our sponsors, the Center for Mark Twain Studies in Elmira, New York. They're the ones that make this whole Trouble Begins series possible. They've been supporting us for many years. If you would like to support the Trouble Begins series and other programs here at the house, there is a green button at the very bottom of your screen that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here. Every dollar helps us, whether it's $1, $5, more dollars. All of it helps the Trouble Begins series. It helps us keep our doors open. The Mark Twain House is open for tours, so you can come and visit us if you would like. I will also point out, as many of you have already seen, there's a chat on the side of your screen. Feel free to go ahead and talk amongst yourself during the presentation there. I will ask everybody as a friendly reminder that we would like to keep all comments and questions friendly and respectful and mindful during tonight's presentation. If you have a question for either Anne or Laura, please use that Ask a Question feature at the very bottom of your screen. It would also be helpful to us if you're addressing it to one or the other. Let me know in that Ask a Question feature as well who you would like to have answer your question. I think that's basically it. So I'm going to introduce our guests now. We have Dr. Laura Trombley and Dr. Anne Ryan here to discuss Mark Twain and critical race theory. They will be exploring Mark Twain's writings as just one example of how thoroughly American it is to try to unravel the knot of racism, and U.S. history. Laura is a scholar, a teacher, a leader, a passionate advocate for the liberal arts and Southwestern University's 16th and first woman president. She's a preeminent Mark Twain scholar and the author of books such as 2011's Mark Twain's Other Women and 1994's Mark Twain in the Company of Women. Anne graduated in 1985 from Lemoyne as an English major and attended the University of Virginia, where she earned her PhD in American literature. Her primary scholarly work has been on the life and writings of Mark Twain. She's particularly interested in 19th century American culture, popular culture, as well as the canonical and literary sort. And it writes frequently on the history of race and racism in America. So I will bring them both back on and we'll get them here and on screen to give their presentation. So welcome, Laura, welcome, Anne. Thank you both so much for being here this evening. It's so great to have you both. And I will turn it over to you guys.
Great. Hello, everyone. It's strange. I know there are people out there, and we certainly hope you enjoy this evening. I'm Anne Ryan.
And I'm Laura Skandera Trombley, speaking to you from Texas.
And I'm speaking from beautiful upstate New York. So why don't I say a couple words about how we'll proceed? We're going to begin with I guess as close as we can say trigger warnings from Laura and I, as close as we ever give trigger warnings. We generally just sort of bash on into things, but we're going to start with a couple of warnings about what we're going to do, and then we'll slowly move into some definitions about critical race theory and some explorations of Twain's literature. And we'll be going back and forth between some PowerPoints just to give you a rest from looking at us. So our topic tonight is, as Jody said, critical race theory and Mark Twain. And we're going to begin with this warning. Those of you who are expecting us to defend Mark Twain, in all likelihood, are going to be a little bit disappointed. The impulse to celebrate the person of Mark Twain, we find is a kind of stumbling block to appreciating the literature, but that stumbling block has a pretty old history. by as early as 1901, Twain is being lauded as the, quote, American lion, a kind of defender of freedom. The illustration on the left is in response to an essay that he wrote indicting imperialism, persons sitting in darkness. And on the right, we have the sort of iconic image of Twain, the freedom fighter, the white man in the white suit. And, this is an image that Twain himself, didn't mind and would occasionally enjoy marketing. But since that time, it's become entrenched in our response to Twain. So we even have, I find this just like a very weird idea, a Mark Twain Memorial Shrine in Florida, Missouri. And if you go inside this space, they've sort of encapsulated this little shack that he was supposedly born in. We have Twain frequently represented as kind of a piece of Americana. This is those of you who've been to the Hartford House, you've seen the Lego version of Mark Twain. Now, I don't want you suddenly thinking Dr. Ryan hates Legos. Who doesn't love a Lego? But if we start to think of Twain as kind of a children's toy, we might be distancing ourselves more and more from that complicated literature that so many of us enjoy. Here's an image from the Epcot Center where an automatic Mark Twain is in dialogue with Ben Franklin as they sit on top of the Statue of Liberty. Now, you just don't see this with, Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. This is a very particular response of American culture to the person of Mark Twain. And, as I said, Twain would not have minded this at all. I think he'd be absolutely thrilled with the Lego statue, and he loved the mechanics of his automated self talking to Ben Franklin. But the more we start to imagine Mark Twain as the story we want to tell, the more complicated it's going to be if we start to explore some of the darker elements of his literature. And so this is what we see in response. The more we attempt to insist upon the goodness of Mark Twain, and I'll go back a little bit, that white man in the white suit, the more this becomes the content of what we want to teach, the more we're going to end up with a backlash from students and parents and all sorts of individuals who feel as though we're missing what makes Twain's literature at times damaging. And I'll read from this. This was a resolution that put out by the Assembly of the State of New Jersey in 2019. The legislature encourages school districts to remove the novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. They don't even have the title right, which is a little annoying, from the school curriculum, and instead to select literature that does not contain racial slurs and other highly offensive language, which may cause students to feel uncomfortable and marginalized. Now, this isn't exactly the topic of what we're here to discuss tonight. I think if you're asking students not to feel uncomfortable as they're reading Huck Finn, you're probably teaching it incorrectly. And often one of the things we'll see that students are responding to is a reading of Huck Finn that is actually a reading of Mark Twain. We invite them to celebrate the goodness of the man and to ignore what's painful in the literature. And I think that's problematic. So when Laura and I were initially working on the article that this talk is based upon, we wanted to make clear that we are not here to kind of cheerlead for that Saint Mark Twain. And truth be told, we don't actually think Twain would be that interested in finally in that version of himself either.
Well, now I think this is where I jump into the conversation, and that is with the warning, those of you who expect us to indict, condemn, or cancel Mark Twain, you will also be disappointed. So I think right by now we've actually disappointed our entire audience, and we're only 5 minutes into our presentation. So having said that, let's just take a minute and talk a little bit about The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and the very differing kind of reception that it has received over the years. And so today, I think when you talk about Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a very typical response is this was Mark Twain's classic novel about either the evils of slavery or, as it has also been described, as a fun boyhood romp. And you have some really very different kinds of descriptions happening here. But let's go back to the beginning, which in the United States, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was published 1 year earlier in Britain. It came to the States a year later, and it was immediately banned by a Concord library, and for the reason that they found it to be immoral. Now, their description of immorality was interestingly due to the fact that a great deal of dialect was used in fact, expressly throughout the novel. And they banned it and called it the veriest trash, and thought that the only audience that could possibly be interested in reading the novel would be, quote, the slums and not intelligent, respectable people. And it remains still to be one of the most frequently books banned in America, and by both sides of the conversation. So banned due to its use of epithets, banned because of the kinds of subjects that it interacts and encounters through the course of the novel. The Concord librarians weren't at all disturbed by the usage of racial epithets. Rather, it was the little boy who skipped school, enjoyed sunning himself naked, and smoked. Also, they were upset that he was poor and felt that poor should not be portrayed as role models. And the fact that he was the son of an Irishman was also a real touch point for them. In fact, something that people don't really talk about too often is actually the title of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The usage of the name Huckleberry Finn immediately would identify this child as first poor. He does not have a first, so to speak, Christian name. Instead, he's given a slang name. We never find out what his birth name is. And Finn was also a very common usage to identify Irish Catholics. And at the time, the notion was there were ample stereotypes about Irish, that they were lazy, that they were drunk, that they were dirty. And in fact, you can see Twain playing with those stereotypes when it comes to Huck and his father. Then if we continue, what I really enjoy here is Twain's response to his banning by the librarians. He, of course, is delighted by it because he understands, much like I think P.T. Barnum did, and Twain and Barnum actually knew each other, and at one time thought about going into business together. Probably best for both of them, they didn't. But Twain understood that to ban something is to probably increase sales of something. As he says here, it will cause the purchasers of the book to read it out of curiosity. And so he is pretty excited about the banning. And I think if he knew of the history of banning in the United States, that would probably please him even more so. Then 20 years after this was published, the Brooklyn Public Library joined the book banners and removed the novel from its shelves, declaring, quote, Huck was a deceitful boy who said sweat when he should have said perspiration, end quote. How dare he? And again, one of the things that we see as incredibly important about the novel is Twain's usage of dialect, that he was finally presenting Americans as they spoke. And the fact that you see a riverboat with named the Walter Scott that has gone aground and is sinking, that was Twain waving goodbye to the kind of exalted position British literature had within America at that time, as Twain felt it was time for Americans to speak like Americans and to create an American literature. So in looking at Twain in his time and the kind of individuals that he knew, he had a very interesting group of friends and acquaintances. So he had friendships with Walter McGinn, Booker T. Washington, and Frederick Douglass. All of them were extraordinary leaders and social activists and speakers as well as writers. And here I think you have a really interesting life spent where Twain was constantly evolving in his views. He did not remain, so to speak, a son of the South. He did not remain the person he was when he was born in Florida, Missouri, and then moved to Hannibal. So if you can go to the next slide. Here he writes to Olivia Langdon and about a conversation that he had with Frederick Douglass. And Twain was very much aware of the kind of discrimination that children were experiencing in the North. We're not talking about the Southern states here. So in looking at his life, I kind of see him as almost a post-Southerner who had evolved with, so to speak, Northern sensibilities. But of course, dichotomies never work. But when you think about where he was born in a slaveholding community and his parents owned enslaved Blacks, he then eventually goes on to marry a woman who was part of an abolitionist family who left their church because their church refused to sign an abolitionist pledge. In fact, his wife's father, Jervis Langdon, was one of those who assisted Frederick Douglass in his escape from slavery and was functioning as part of the Underground Railroad in Elmira, New York. Twain goes on to support Blacks who are in law school, who are artists. He believes that it is his responsibility when it comes to reparations. He supports causes. If we move ahead to the next slide, we can see where Twain is writing the law school dean at Yale, saying that he does think that it is his responsibility as well as others to support Blacks and have them gain entry into places where they obviously have been barred. Then ultimately, when you think about the journey that he has made, one of his great friends becomes Ulysses S. Grant. And he actually helps Grant publish his autobiography. So for someone who may or may not have fought in the Confederate Army, it's still unclear about that. My sense in having looked into it a little bit is he was a member of the so-called Marion Rangers for a brief period of time. But like some other ventures that he did, he pretty quickly realized that this was not something that he wanted to do. And he later satirized it in a short story. But he goes from there to, and then you could go to the next slide, to where he's actually at a fundraiser for Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee Institute. So he made himself very much a public individual in support of Black causes. And in some of the work that I've done, I think that his spouse was absolutely instrumental in helping him shape his views. She was highly educated. Her family really was a family of activists, and they ran in activist circles. And you can read through a great deal of correspondence between the two where they actually talk about race, and they talk about ways in which they need to work in order to try and support Blacks and to make sure that they can kind of create a more equitable society. So these are some aspects to Twain that I'm not sure that everyone is familiar with. Then going forward, I think we then have to ask the question, is Twain a racial progressive? And I would say maybe at times. Yes, he was. So I would go with the sometimes answer, and I'm now going to toss the ball back to Anne.
And, you know, I think that what we're trying to do here is to and I say this with some, you know, not very small amount of humility, I guess, you know, working with a biographer, that we're actually trying to move the conversation a little bit away from these simplistic questions. Like, is he a progressive? Sure. Okay. Is he a racist? Sometimes, yes. If I stand in front of a group of students and say, this man never in his life used a racial epithet in an offensive way or thought a thought that was in some way racist, I'm going to lose my credibility, and I'm also not going to be telling the truth. On the other hand, Twain is an individual, as Laura has just suggested, you know, who was profoundly aware of the humanity and the decency of the African-American people that he grew up around. He was inspired by many people of color. So the response is, you know, sometimes. Where we want to move the conversation a little bit is into this, I think, interesting world of critical race theory. And I know that some of you out there are saying, no, it's not interesting. It's dangerous. It's gonna, you know, it's gonna upset our children. It's a gimmick. One of the things that we're hoping to do is to suggest that actually Twain has been practicing some of the principles that we now identify as critical race theory long before anyone was talking about it. So one aspect of critical race theory, you know, it comes from the world of philosophy, political science, and sociology. It invites students and researchers to ask questions about the nature of race and the source of racism. So let's just think about that. That's the critical part. It doesn't mean criticizing. It's inviting people to ask questions. And if that's part of the definition, Mark Twain is 100% there. He is always in a kind of pose of inquiry around issues of race. He's often sort of pulling at the threads of other people's assumptions about race. And yet, and there's a kind of but coming here, because you'll notice I have a comma there. One of my criticisms about critical race theory is that it tends to get caught up in questions of justice, and it's got a kind of yes or no, you know, good or bad orientation. And that sometimes makes it hard to explore literary texts. Literary texts are messy. They present us with complicated, uneasy truths. This is a total aside, and you can just end the Zoom session right now. But in New York State, increasingly, poetry and drama are not being taught in middle and high school. And I have a colleague who's a biologist, and she said what they're seeing is that students' ability to grapple with ambiguity, complication, mystery is being undermined. That students are really comfortable with things that fit into neat boxes, and literature won't do that. And so I'd like to give an example of this. This is from chapter 2 of Huck Finn. It's a pretty innocuous moment. This is when Huck has snuck out to meet Tom. He's met up with Tom. He says, when we was 10 foot off, Tom whispered to me and wanted to tie Jim to a tree for fun. But I said, no, he might wake and make a disturbance, but nothing would do, but Tom must crawl to where Jim was on his hands and knees and play something on him. Tom said he slipped Jim's hat off his head and hung it on a limb right over him. And Jim stirred a little, but he didn't wake. Now, if we leave it there, that's just kind of a playful moment. If I can create and invite into the classroom some context, I might bring in an editorial from the Buffalo Express. Now, at this point, I'm not going to use the N-word, but I should tell you that the title of this was Only an N-Word. That's it. And Twain is the editor of the Buffalo Express at this point. In his editorial, he responds to the lynching of a Black man who was hung by, quote, an avenging mob, the evidence that doomed the guiltless wretch being a hat. So I can put that context around this section. We almost have the feeling that Twain is sort of restaging that horrible moment, as Jim is sort of lining up against a tree and two white boys are thinking of maybe pulling out a rope. Twain targets the, quote, knightly hearts of the chivalrous Southern man as he defends, quote, outraged white womanhood. So at this point, I know some of you are saying, wait a second, you were the one telling us you weren't going to defend Twain. This is what makes him so complicated. He doesn't sign the editorial. If I can bring all that in, right, I can enjoy the kind of messiness of a literary text. And what I just did is what I think of as critical race theory.
And this is where, for me, I really appreciate Twain's genius, because when you start Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, of course, you see Huck and Tom, and the way that Twain initially portrays them is that Tom is the favored one. Tom comes from a solid family. He has financial security. He is attending church. He goes to school. And then you have Huck. Huck doesn't have a mother. There's never any comment about what happened to his mother, but it isn't too far afield to make the assumption that Pap, who is one of the most terrifying fathers, I think, in literature, very likely murdered her. So he grows up motherless. He's the son of an Irishman. Huck speaks with a bit of his father's accent as well as a Southern accent. So he has formed his own Southern Irish dialect. And he is extremely poor to where he has to sleep outside on the ground. But by the end of the novel, they crisscross. All of a sudden, Tom becomes the perfect embodiment of a Klan member. And you have Huck, who has realized there is no way that I can remain in this place. I'm going to light out for the territory. For Huck, the choice is it's better to go somewhere into the unknown than it is to remain here, which kind of gets me to just a few more words about critical race theory, where the theorists say that they are mainly concerned with institutions and systems, and it draws upon the work of thinkers such as Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass. And this is where I think Twain really makes a very interesting contribution and a meaningful contribution. Proponents tend to think and understand race as a creation of society, not a biological reality. So as Huck runs away, he meets a host of characters, most of them quite dubious, some of them actually murderous, with a striking exception. The one exception is Jim. And as they sail the wrong way down the Mississippi, with Jim, Huck experiences for one of the rare moments in his life a feeling of safety. Even though they're on a rickety pine plank raft that threatens to capsize at any moment, Huck and Jim both realize that being in the middle of the Mississippi on a raft is a lot safer than it is being ashore. So Clemens describes the freedom and peace that the two find, all the while they are dodging steamboats, they're dodging snags, they are trying to escape Huck's alcoholic and abusive father, as well as slave hunters. It's though this perfect simplicity that the two of them can actually enjoy happiness and peace if they are removed from American religion, education, culture, and law. And it is that authenticity that American culture has been draining from the novel ever since it was published. And Anne started with this when she was showing, and I love Legos too, heaven knows, but when she was showing some of the ways in which Twain is now depicted. And we also need to really keep in mind a pivotal moment in the novel, of course, and I think the one that most people see as the climax of the novel is when Huck has to decide whether or not he's going to tell the slave hunters Jim's location. And Huck says, I was a trembling because I'd got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell. At that moment, Huck rejects everything that his culture has tried to teach him, that he should objectify Jim and treat Jim really as commerce. And he decides that he's not going to do that. And interestingly, of course, Twain never gives Huck's age, and Huck kind of vacillates in terms of his actions and the things that he says and the way that he describes things, kind of between ages of 8 and probably 12 years old. And so as Twain makes it clear in the novel that fiction can be dangerous, and it talks about dangerous things. And if he sometimes talks about and portrays the truth, as you have with Huck and Jim on the raft, that all humans are created equal, he also reveals that humans can be awful cruel to one another when they go ashore. So let's talk a little bit then about what I see as how homogenized Adventures of Huckleberry Finn has become, and how I think that is also a product of American culture. So if we kind of move forward a little bit, this is one of my favorite things to watch. And, you know, it kind of, in a way, reminds me a little bit of, again, one of my favorite movies, Get Out. Because when you're watching this in retrospect, it's such an extraordinary departure from any meaning that Twain wanted to try and leave the reader with in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. You've got it all right here. But let me just, for a moment, talk about the Mark Twain Memorial Shrine, a place where I've never been, but you can bet it's on the bucket list. I so want to go to the Memorial Shrine. So of course, when we talk about memorial shrines, we're really talking about the definition of a memorial shrine is that it's a holy place. It's a temple, it's a sanctuary, it's an altar. And it's a place that people visit and treat with respect because it's connected with someone who has passed away. And so the Mark Twain Memorial Shrine, as Anne was saying, actually has created this interesting capsule where the boyhood shack that Twain was born into has been moved into. It's not on its original location. It actually was moved to this current location. And it really has become an interesting kind of pilgrimage that people make, where they look at a wooden shack. Florida, Missouri was always a postage stamp, and actually it no longer exists at this point, except for the Memorial Shrine. But by calling it a memorial shrine, I think it's a fascinating way to depict the more popular conception of Twain. So here we have Mickey Rooney, who, and I was looking at this today, who never was taller than about 5'1". He's 20 years old, and he's now playing an 8-year-old boy. And you can see just by the very trailer here that Anne took some screenshots of. It's Mark Twain's Cavalcade of Boyhood Adventure, which I think has really absolutely nothing to do with the novel. But we also have a rich history that whenever Hollywood becomes involved with any kind of work of literature, what you remembered the work of literature as being, you should not expect to see that on the screen. And of course, they have created a new title as well. He's now the beloved rascal, when actually, when you make your way through the novel, of course, he's beloved, but I would not say that he's a rascal. He's probably more in terms of a little bit more on the saintly status. So then this gets to trying to unravel this knot of race and racism in American history, and how this has been a central preoccupation of American culture from the very moment that we arrived on these shores. So as Du Bois pronounced, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Twain was extremely aware of this. One of the things that, as a biographer, I'm constantly reckoning with is Twain lived an extremely long life. He passed away when he was 74 years old, and he lived through everything. So he was there for the Dred Scott decision. He understood what it meant when the Southern states seceded from the Union. He understood and could see the Civil War from both sides, and he was still alive when Jim Crow came into being. And at the end of his life, he wrote The United States of Lyncherdom, where he wanted to try and address what he saw as the terrible and increasing violence that he was seeing against Black people. And yet, that was a work that was never published in his lifetime. He made it clear that if it was to be published, that would be the end of him selling anything south of the Mason-Dixon. It was only published posthumously. So Twain, when you look at the emphasis on race and culture and history, Twain was already in that place. But what has happened ever since the publication of that novel is he has become the Lego man. And Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is about a rascal who's having fun with his buddy Jim.
Okay, and we included this image just to sort of, again, sort of emphasize the way in which the novel has tended to be, efforts have been made to sanitize it by eliminating anything that could be offensive. I don't think that's one of the goals of critical race theory. I think one of the things that we're aiming for is to come up with a more nuanced understanding of what race might be. And as Laura was just saying, if you remove the N word and replace it with slave, what you've actually just done is re-enslaved Jim, who we find out was free all along. There are all sorts of
another aspect of that, to use an academic word, problematic about this text, is that the racial epithets were replaced by the word slave as though this is a job title. And this breezes over the still lingering racism captured in this racial epithet that Twain wants you to hear. He wants you to hear the ugliness of this word. And did Twain know that this was an ugly word at the time? Absolutely, there's no doubt about that. However, somewhere Twain is cackling, because this version immediately saw a huge increase in the sales of the unexpurgated version. And yet again, trifle with art, try and ban it, and the reaction is going to be, you're going to then see renewed interest in the original work.
Okay, so we're moving towards more sort of explorations of aspects of what critical race theory is and is not. So one of the things that students of critical race theory often wonder about is whether or not race is biological, skin and bones, or cultural. And repeatedly in Twain's work, and I know we're running, getting close to the limit of our time, and there are probably lots of people who have questions, so I won't read all of this, but here's one of the Kemble drawings of Pap Finn. And in the bolded section, Twain writes, there weren't no color in his face, where his face showed it was white, not like another man's white, but a white to make a body sick, a white to make a body's flesh crawl, a tree-toad white, a fish belly white. Twain is inviting us to look carefully at a man who is in some ways completely black. He's covered with blackness. He's covered with mud. His hair is black. It's hanging down in front of him. And his skin color is absolutely like death white. And yet in the tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson, we have a white woman, majestic in form and stature, even beautiful, Twain says. And I think the even is really interesting. But of course, she was meek and humble enough when around white people. To all intents and purposes, Roxy was as white as anybody. And I think those are really interesting qualifiers. But the 1/16 of her, which was black, outvoted the other 15th and made her a Negro. Her son, too, was a slave, and by fiction of law and custom, a Negro. If there were any line from Twain's canon that I think could be a wonderful sort of synopsis of what critical race theory is, it's the fiction of law and custom. If we go through Twain's literature, we find over and over again these complicated people. And when I'm talking with students, I'll say, look, we've all got that horrible uncle, who says terrible racist things, and yet somehow we still kind of love him. We're all surrounded by complicated people who are flawed in all sorts of ways. Twain understood that, but he also understood the frame that I don't know why I needed to do that. That was a very strange gesture, but the frame that the frame that surrounds those individuals, that the laws and customs that inform their activities are actually the source of their racist beliefs and choices. So, in this way, I think that Twain is doing exactly what we mean by critical race theory. So, is Twain a critical race theorist? Yes, no.
My vote is sometimes.
Occasionally, sure. And this leads us to maybe our first conclusion. To understand American history and culture and identity, we must understand how race frames all three. I won't do the frame again, unless you actually really need that. There is no possible way to know who we are as Americans. As Laura said, Du Bois said, the problem of the 20th century is the color line. Well, we can step back and look at Charles Chestnut and W.B. Du Bois and even Emily Dickinson sort of working in black and white. Mark Twain stands alongside generations of writers, artists, and activists who locate American identity in the crosshairs of our struggles with race. If one of the things we're afraid of when we talk about critical race theory is that it might upset our children, I think one of the things we want to think about is what happens if we don't upset them? What happens if they don't take a hard look at who we are and where we come from? Mark Twain is asking us to do that. So I guess my conclusion is that Mark Twain is very much interested in what we now call critical race theory. And he's not afraid to hurt our feelings as we explore it. Over to you, Laura.
And then I'm here to talk about humor. and let's always keep in mind that Twain was a satirist, and satire and humor, they are a form of disruption and anarchy. And right now, satire is something that may be becoming endangered. And his genius was how he directs and orchestrates that anarchy. And because Twain was always careful to wrap the hardest things that we have to understand and perhaps discuss and realize within humor, he was able to say things that if he tried to say it straight, so to speak, without humor, it would have been perhaps not listened to, unaccepted, contentious, but satire allows you to say things that perhaps sometimes in society you cannot. Now, Anne and I were really privileged to be invited to attend the Mark Twain Humor Prize this past weekend. We felt that some Twain scholars needed to represent, and so we were gracious and humble, and so we went there. And Jon Stewart, who is a satirist, was honored, and Trevor Noah, who is also a very, very successful comedian, had an interesting comment about Stewart that I'll contest here. Trevor said that Stewart created a genre. Everyone thought for a very long time that comedy was an escape from seriousness. No, we just make the jokes, don't say anything real. And I think what Jon Stewart successfully did was invert that idea, and he said, no, comedy, and especially satire, will be the home of authenticity and difficult subjects and ideas. Well, I absolutely agree with Trevor, except Jon Stewart didn't invent satire. Satire existed long before there was Jon Stewart. And since Twain, the Mark Twain Prize came about because Twain remains, and this is what comedians and satirists will say, the best stand-up comedian who ever lived. I think that Jon Stewart learned quite a bit at Mark Twain's knee. And in Stewart's remarks, he said, comedy survives every moment. And it is in those most difficult moments that we most need comedy. And this brought to mind one of my favorite Mark Twain quotations, and this is how I'll end it. And I think it perfectly describes both Pudd'nhead Wilson, a work that is not read frequently enough, and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a work that needs to be reread more frequently. Twain said, humor is tragedy plus time. And that's what we're talking about here tonight.
All right. Hi, welcome. Hi. That's so great. I am going to put a link in the chat based off of that to a Trouble Begins that we had last fall about Mark Twain and the origins of stand-up comedy, because I think that's a great little link there to previous Trouble Begins. So if anybody in our audience wants to talk about that a little bit more, follow that link. So I'll start asking you guys some audience questions, and anybody in the audience, if you have any more, use that ask a question feature and we'll get there for you. So one of the first ones, and this is, I guess, to both of you, but I guess we'll start with Anne and then Laura can answer as well. Have either of you read John Clinch's book, Finn? And what are your thoughts?
Yes.
Yes, I have read John Lynch's book, Finn, and I think I may have written a book review of it. I can't remember anything anymore. But Anne, why don't you start?
Well, I think that it's okay. I don't even know if anyone's out there. I can just see Laura and Jody, so I feel like we're just hanging out together. And I hope Mr. Clinch isn't really listening right now, but it felt a little bit, again, like an apologist's work. Like we're trying to prove that Pap Finn was a, kind of a man with a soul somewhere, that he had a relationship with an African-American woman, that it just felt like it was a kind of contextualizing that, again, had at its heart this desire to redeem Twain. But I'm cranky, so that's my response. Don't listen to me.
Whenever I read works like that, first of all, it's always really hard for me to read them because I've done all this research, and so his portrayal of Pap was wildly ahistorical, and that always gets me nervous. And when I read it, it very much reminded me of the time that Anne and I saw Val Kilmer's one-man show, where Val kind of did a Jim Morrison stream of consciousness, Mark Twain-ish type of presentation. and it was in Los Angeles, and people loved it. The audience thought this was the most amazing thing they had ever seen. They didn't even mind when his fake nose became unstuck and he had to keep, pressing it back on his face. But I was watching it with, again, I'm thinking, well, no, Twain was not a Christian Science fan. No, actually, he published a lot of things, denouncing it. But then you just have to give it up and say, this is a creative work. You can, Twain morphs into anything. And so that's kind of how I saw Finn. You can, forget any kind of, so to speak, factual authenticity. It's just fiction.
That's a nicer way to put it.
I think we need both ways. It's good. It's good. All right, so here's a question that also got a couple of votes. They were wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about whether George or John as the inspiration for Jim. George Griffin or
John Lewis.
Yes.
I would say neither. That it, Twain himself claims that it's Daniel Quarles that this is the source for Jim. But again, I think that Twain is a brilliant enough artist that he's piecing together all sorts of influences to create the character of Jim. And it's unlikely that it would have been George Griffin because he's already working on Huck Finn before he really meets George. He's got a deeper, longer connection to some of those enslaved people that he knew from Hannibal. None of whom, by the way, are referenced in the Hannibal museum setup where Jody is right now. But I'm just a little snarky.
And I would agree with Anne on this point because I always agree with Anne. But I will also say Twain lied about everything. So if Twain said that he based this character on the individuals he knew at Quarles Farm, who knows? And he often liked to have a lot of fun when people would ask him about the truthiness of his autobiography. And he basically said, I like to make stuff up. And that's, again, I see that as one of the more fascinating aspects of Twain, that he was so free to admit that.
All right, so before I get to another question, I do want to, since I know you guys cannot see the comments that are happening right now, one of our guests says, your presentation was the best I've heard on the topic of critical race theory. So just throwing that out to you guys.
Thanks, Mom.
Well, if Stephen is your mom, okay. we're having a great time already.
You are now, Stephen.
All right, so next question. What are your thoughts on Pudd'nhead Wilson being introduced more often in the classroom, sometimes in place of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn? Seems to be popping up more and more recently.
Well, I think that you're still going to have the problem of some of the racist language. But if I controlled the world, which I do not, one of the things I'd suggest is maybe the response isn't choosing the Twain text. And you have to think about, how different and wildly, any high school or elementary school teachers out there, you have so much of my respect because, the challenges you face are so much greater than anything I'm going to face in the classroom. But maybe the solution is to design curriculums that include a greater variety of authors that a lot of students aren't hearing about, like Paul Laurence Dunbar and Charles Chestnut and Harriet Jacobs, and that you put Twain in dialogue with all these other people thinking about race. And maybe then it doesn't carry so much weight. But I do think the short answer for me is I think Pudd'nhead is a really fun novel to teach and maybe a little easier to work around some of the things that trouble us about Huck Finn.
Yeah, I think for me, that's probably the more interesting exploration when it comes to racial constructs and culture. It also is a really interesting novel when you look at the kind of fluidity of gender there and the cross-dressing that takes place. Twain experimented with that in Huck Finn, but he really uses that as a major plot device in Pudd'nhead Wilson. And so, you know, that's you could say that's an unfinished or somewhat incomplete manuscript, but the level that he was working at was clearly a sign of growth and expansion over some of the things that he was doing in Huck Finn.
Great. So our last question so far, so if anybody has any more, put some in there, talks about the intentions of doing the new Southern edition of Huckleberry Finn. And somebody added on to that question is, don't we deprive current readers of Twain if we eliminate the N-word from our discussions of Twain's work? So you guys kind of talked about that a little bit, but, you know, any other thoughts on getting rid of that word in the book? Or
no, I don't think that you don't change art. You don't put pants on the David. You know, you should, though, and I think this is one of the real problems with the text, when we're talking about Huck Finn, is too often, because of the way in which it has been presented, that it's a playful romp, it's a boy's tale. I think that's a real misnomer. That's really not how Twain intended the work. The subjects that are discussed there are really hard, and there's an enormous amount of violence. Talk about triggering. You hardly have a chapter without something in there that's triggering. When you think about the scene where, and I talk about this with the classes that I teach at the university, when you really try and fill your mind with the picture of a little boy who's 8 years old, who is so terrified of his father and cannot bear being beaten anymore, sits with a shotgun on his lap, and if his father stirs, he's going to kill him. This is not a text that, in my view, should be taught to children. I think it needs to be taught with context and history, and at a point where it can be understood on very different terms than it is often taught. You know, there's this, I think, prevailing kind of really privileged attitude where it's a classic. We should all read it because it's good. Along and mix in with that, you know, this false premise that it's about buddies going down the Mississippi. As I said, it needs to be reread, and it needs to be carefully taught.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that every now and then you get white people who for some reason just fetishize that word, right? That somehow they're being deprived of something if they can't say that word. Just, you know, seek professional counseling is my response. But I think that removing the word from the novel doesn't change what the editors were trying to change. You know, it's not as though once that word was gone, no one's ever going to speak it again, and all, you know, racism has disappeared from the country. I think you don't teach it in an environment where the students aren't prepared, as Laura just said. I think that if you're going to teach it, you teach it in conjunction with other texts. For example, Childish Gambino, you know, you could do a little bit of Spike Lee. You could bring in, you know, contemporary artists who are really going down some different rivers. They just happen to be Lenox Avenue, right? That you can really put a much better, oh, we can end this way, frame, you know, around the text.
Not again, the frame. And the whole exploration of dialect, I was giving a lecture to a class earlier this fall about Lil Nas X and his usage of dialect, and how fascinating it is, and how we now rely and love dialect when you think about that change from how the novel was received, where he used dialect. We've come a long way since then.
All right, so last question for both of you. Laura, let's start with you. What led both of you to make Mark Twain the principal source of your literary career?
Money. No, that's not why. You know, the super short version is I became involved in a project where 100 letters of Mark Twain were discovered. And I knew very little about Twain at the time. And I just had a sense that he was kind of a solitary individual, a journalist, a riverboat pilot. But these were letters to his 3 daughters, and he was speaking to them as intellectual equals. I then read all of the biographies that had been written at the time, which whenever the women in the family were mentioned, it was, I would say, frequently, unfortunately, fairly misogynistic. And in fact, one biographer, I won't name names, said he basically could have been a much better writer if he hadn't saddled himself with Olivia Langdon and all those kids. And I thought, wow, this just doesn't square with what I'm reading here. And so that kind of started my fascination with him.
Great. Anne?
I went to an MLA, and I was actually that's a Modern Language Association conference. And I was actually giving a paper on Willa Cather. Don't get me wrong, she's a blast. But the Willa Cather folks were in one room, and the Twain folks were in another room, and the Twain people seemed to be having a great time. And I'm a shallow person, and that's how I started on Twain studies. So
right, money, free drinks. There you go.
What else do you need? Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. We are out of time for the evening. I so appreciate you both spending the last hour with us. It's been such a great topic, and hopefully I'll see you both soon, and we'll be able to chat more. So thank you to everybody.
Bye, Jody.
In the
Thank you,
audience.
Jody. Thank
We got
you.
the frames going.